Today we're going to continue our sprint through the way that Java does graphical user interfaces with Swing. So we're going to take a look at Swing buttons. We've looked at one already, the J button. There are actually a number of different things that are buttons, and this can be understood if we look at the class hierarchy, which we'll look at in just a bit. Remember, we've talked about object-oriented stuff, and one of the things about Java is that it's object-oriented out the wazoo. And then, as we've seen, the basic J-frame has a content pane. In the content pane, there's that border layout where you have these 5 different pieces where you put stuff. And that may seem restrictive, and it is. In other words, if I can only put one thing in each of those 5 places. Typical user interface has a lot more than 5 things. So what's up with that? That's where this Jpanel thing comes in. So a Jpanel is just sort of the thing that we put other stuff in. So the idea is you take a Jpanel, you put the Jpanel in the thing, but the Jpanel is a container that we can put other stuff in. And we've sort of seen an example of that. The default layout for the Jpanel is a flow layout that we've seen that preserves the size of the different buttons. As we've seen, things like the grid layout doesn't. And a Jpanel can have any one of the different layouts that you want. Then the next thing is, okay, it's one thing to have buttons. We've already seen buttons and they respond to our clicks, but they don't do anything. So any application is pretty much useless unless it does something. I mean, why does it exist? It exists because it's supposed to do something. So how can we get these buttons to do something? When you click a button on the computer, you expect something to happen. What is it that happens? Well, that depends on the user interface, and if it's a well-designed interface, then you can pretty much figure out what a thing does when you click on it. There are actually a number of different ways of dealing with the user interaction with the buttons, the user manipulation, which is mostly a click. Of those, by far the most flexible and the one that I found to be by far the most useful is something called an action listener. And that is because pretty much every Swing widget that a user can manipulate fires something called an action event. And if you listen for those action events, then you can write code that does something that you, the user, want to happen. We'll be seeing some examples of this. I've just sort of an example here that doesn't do anything terribly interesting. We're going to work our way up to interesting things. Then just to kind of continue, there's a thing called a toolbar that we're kind of used to. For some reason, Microsoft started calling theirs a ribbon. I don't know, ribbon, toolbar, whatever. It's the same basic thing. It's just typically something at the top of the application that has different buttons that are typically just like an icon. So like one might be the save icon, which has a tiny image of an old 3.5-inch floppy disk. So I saw a meme the other day. It was, I guess somebody had found one of these floppies and they were showing it to their kids, and the kids said, "Wow, Dad 3D printed the save icon." So, okay, so we'll look at that because, and then another thing that comes up is gracefully exiting. We've touched on this. The default behavior when you close a J frame, again, the window that holds everything, is to just disappear and do nothing. So the application keeps running. that's not what a user normally expects. For the purposes of our demonstrations, though, to make the application end so we don't have to kind of red square it, we've said exit unclose. So when you close the window and the whole application disappears. That's not a terribly user-friendly type of thing. As we said, that what you want is you want to check with the user. Now there are some subtleties on this. If we're dealing with an application like, let's say, Microsoft Word is actually a nice exemplar for a pretty well-designed user interface. So in an application like that where you have a state that can be changed by the user editing. So I open a document, I change the document, and before I've saved it, it's kind of in this intermediate state. It's in the state where I've changed it, but it hasn't been saved. So there, if I go to exit, it says you have unsaved changes, you want to save them, blah, blah, blah. So that's good user interface. On the other hand, if I just exit without making any changes, it just exits. So again, that's a little bit more of a subtle thing. So we're going to take the first step in that. We're just going to always check with the user. And the thing is that can be annoying in its own thing. And sometimes you just have to pick your poison. Would you rather be a little bit annoyed by having to do one extra click, or would you rather lose data by having the thing shut down? So that will involve a couple of things. One is, because the JFrame doesn't fire action listeners, it would be nice if it did, but it doesn't, it fires things called window events. And so, but we're going to use the same mechanism to listen to that, only instead of an action listener, we're going to have a window listener. And then we'll see about turning that into a dessert topping and a floor wax, depending on how we choose to exit it. That will involve something called a J option pane, which is, again, this is just sort of like a one-liner thing that we can do to create these little modal dialog boxes that pop up that you should be very used to if you've been using the computer for any more than 10 minutes. And then, time permitting, we'll start looking at menus, because that's still something which is a thing. Okay, the class hierarchy, and this is just a simplified version. This is just kind of a piece of a very complex class hierarchy. Again, Java takes the object-oriented class hierarchy business to the extreme. In the view of some, it's a little too extreme. That's a matter of opinion. But we can kind of look at what's going on here. And the important thing is that at the very top of the sort of button piece of this is something called an abstract button. Now, what they've done is what we've talked about before about these class hierarchies. What you have with all buttons have many things in common, one of which are things like firing an action event. So when you're designing one of these things, you kind of have a choice. It's like you can put the same thing in each one of these 5 classes, or you can abstract it all the way to a common ancestor, in this case the abstract button. So what they've done, and I think this is a very nice design, is that everything which is common to every button is implemented in the abstract button class. And as its name implies, it's an abstract class, so you never instantiate an abstract button, but that just holds all of the things that are in common. And this is an example of the programmer virtue of laziness. So the laziness says we've implemented it once and got it to work, so we're not going to implement it again. Every time you try to implement the same thing again, the chances are you might do it differently or screw it up. In my case, every time I do that, I do both. So, okay, so we've already looked at the J button, and And it turns out that in things, when you think of things like a menu, that is pretty much just like a button. So the menu itself, you click on it, a little thing pops up, and you click on one of those, and that's just like clicking on a button. So Java said, well, we're going to treat that like a button. And so one of the nice things, and hopefully you can kind of get a sense of this, is that we can ensure that we have the same behavior regardless of where the user decides to make it happen. Specifically, there are typically two ways to exit your application. One is to click on the red X that closes the window, and the other is there's typically like file exit, or I think on Apple it's quit, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. There are two ways of doing it. And what you want to do is you want to ensure that regardless of how the user does it, they get exactly the same result. Okay, so we looked at JButton. The expectation, when you see a button that looks like it should be clicked, then you click on it, you expect something to happen. And what that thing is depends on either what your user expectation is based upon experience. So again, if you see a little icon that has like a little image of an old 3.5 floppy, everybody knows that means save. So as we've seen by itself, the JButton only just has the user interface. It doesn't do anything. So when we click it, it actually fires a whole pile of events, but the action event is the one thing that we're going to focus on. And we're going to do that by creating an action listener, and the action listener is an interface that Swing provides for doing precisely this. And let's see. Okay, so now we're going to introduce the Jpanel. So for maximum flexibility, what we do is instead of putting stuff directly into the content pane, we'll put stuff in a Jpanel as a container for our various widgets. And then there are different ways of laying it out. Again, we're not going to go too deeply into that. We're mostly going to focus on functionality. So the idea is that we put the buttons in a panel, and we put the panel in the content pane. Okay, so the action listener, and there are 3 different ways that we can do this. One of which should be totally avoided, even though there are a lot of tutorials and even books that advocate this bad method. And there are 2 that are not too bad. The one that's bad is something called an anonymous inner class. And we've seen a little bit of this. There's only one instance where an anonymous inner class, in my view, is acceptable, and that's when we're running our model and putting it on the graphics thread. We've seen an example of that. That's not the only way to do it, it's just the most convenient, as it turns out. However, an anonymous inner class will they'll basically just be one. Because it's anonymous, it has no name, and so you can't refer to it anywhere. And because it's sort of bolted onto the widget, that's the only thing that can do. And if you want other widgets to do the similar thing, then you have to have another anonymous inner class for them, which duplicates the code. That's bad. Okay, so the other option is we could actually write a whole separate class that implements the action listener, because it's an interface, and so we can implement it as a separate class. And for extremely large and fancy applications, sometimes that's the best way to go. However, there are circumstances in which you want the action listener to be accessing things in your main window. And so the main approach, the third approach that we will take, is to write an a named inner class within the JFrame that will handle all of these, what to do with the button. So our example is going to be just simply, which button, if I had a bunch of buttons, which button was clicked, and I'm gonna stick it in a J label and just to kind of display that. Okay, so what I want to do is get the time here. All right, I'm going to skip. Okay, we did the gracefully exiting. What I want to do is I want to do the menu bar now, because I want to add this file exit to the menu, and then also show you how we can have work with the other buttons.